Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 14 years, and throughout that extensive career, he had developed an extraordinary ability to read people and sense when something significant was being left unsaid. He could detect the subtle tension that suggested family secrets, recognize the careful word choices that indicated hidden truths, and identify the moments when contestants were performing normalcy rather than genuinely experiencing it. On this crisp October afternoon in 2025, as he prepared to welcome two families onto the stage for what the production schedule indicated would be standard programming, Steve noticed something unusual about one family that triggered his instinct that this taping would deviate dramatically from routine game show proceedings. What would unfold over the next hour would become one of the most shocking and emotionally complex moments in television history, forcing Steve Harvey to confront a family secret so extraordinary and unexpected that he would stand speechless trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he understood about the family standing before him. Before we explore this astonishing story about hidden identities, long-kept secrets, and the moment when carefully constructed facades finally crumble under the weight of truth, if you believe that some secrets are too significant to keep hidden forever, and that honesty matters even when it disrupts comfortable illusions, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these powerful moments that remind us why authenticity and truth-telling matter more than maintaining convenient pretenses. The Reynolds family from Denver, Colorado stood ready to compete, and leading them was 54-year-old Jonathan Reynolds. Jonathan presented as a distinguished professional whose confident bearing and articulate speech suggested someone accustomed to positions of authority and respect. He had introduced himself during preliminary interviews as a successful corporate executive who had spent his career in the financial services industry, rising to senior leadership positions through intelligence, hard work, and strategic thinking. Standing beside Jonathan were his wife of 28 years, Patricia, their adult son Matthew, who was 26 years old, their daughter Emily, who was 23, and Jonathan's younger brother Thomas, who was 50 years old. The family demonstrated appropriate enthusiasm and appeared to embody the kind of successful, close-knit unit that made for appealing television, though Steve noticed something he could not quite articulate about the way Jonathan's children looked at him, a quality of careful observation that suggested they were paying unusually close attention to their father's every word and movement. Jonathan Reynolds had built what appeared from external observation to be an exemplary life characterized by professional success, financial stability, a strong marriage, and well-adjusted children who had both graduated from prestigious universities and established promising careers of their own. He had grown up in modest circumstances in a small town in Kansas, had earned a full scholarship to college, and had worked his way through business school while supporting himself through various jobs. His rise through corporate ranks had been steady and impressive, characterized by strategic thinking, strong interpersonal skills, and the kind of dedication that earned respect from colleagues and subordinates alike. Jonathan and Patricia had married young and had built their life together through mutual support and shared values, creating a home environment that had provided their children with stability, opportunity, and unconditional love. What nobody outside Jonathan's immediate family knew, what he had kept hidden for over 50 years through careful construction of narratives and deliberate omission of certain chapters from his personal history, was that virtually everything about Jonathan's identity and background was based on elaborate fiction. The man standing on the Family Feud stage as Jonathan Reynolds had been born Jennifer Reynolds, assigned female at birth in a conservative rural Kansas community in 1971. Jonathan was a transgender man who had transitioned in his early 20s, long before such transitions were culturally understood or accepted in mainstream American society, and who had spent the subsequent 3 decades living stealth, meaning that he presented as, and was perceived by the world as a cisgender man, without disclosing his transgender status to anyone except those who absolutely needed to know. Jonathan's early life had been characterized by profound gender dysphoria that he had lacked the language or framework to understand during his childhood in the 1970s and early 1980s. He had known from his earliest memories that something was fundamentally wrong with the way people perceived him and the expectations placed on him based on his assigned sex. But growing up in a small conservative town had provided no context for understanding what it meant to be transgender or any possibility of living authentically as male. Jonathan had survived his childhood and adolescence through dissociation, academic achievement as distraction from constant psychological distress, and private fantasies about a future where somehow he might be able to live as the person he knew himself to be rather than the person his body suggested he should be. The opportunity to transition had emerged when Jonathan left his hometown for college, attending a large university where nobody knew his history and where he encountered for the first time the concept of transgender identity through connections with LGBTQ student organizations. He had begun the process of social transition during his sophomore year, adopting male pronouns and the name Jonathan, binding his chest to create a masculine appearance, and gradually building a presentation that allowed him to move through the world as male. Medical transition had followed, including hormone therapy that had masculinized his features and voice, and eventually chest reconstruction surgery that had eliminated the physical characteristics that had caused him the most acute dysphoria. By the time Jonathan completed college and entered the professional workforce, his transition was essentially complete, and he was living fully as male in all contexts. He had made the strategic decision to live stealth rather than being open about his transgender status, a choice motivated partly by the intense discrimination that openly transgender people faced in corporate environments during that era, and partly by his desire to simply live as himself without his transgender status, defining every interaction and relationship. Jonathan had legally changed all his identity documents, had moved to a different state where nobody knew his history, and had built a professional and personal life in which he was simply Jonathan Reynolds, a man whose past was unremarkable and whose gender identity was never questioned. Meeting Patricia had complicated Jonathan's commitment to living stealth because entering into a romantic relationship required disclosure of information that he had worked so hard to keep private. Jonathan had waited several months before telling Patricia the truth about his gender history, terrified that disclosure would end the relationship, but recognizing that building a life partnership on deception was neither ethical nor sustainable. Patricia's response had been remarkably accepting for someone with no previous experience or understanding of transgender identity. She had needed time to process the information and to educate herself about what it meant, but ultimately she had recognized that the person she loved was exactly who he said he was, and that his gender history did not change the reality of their relationship or their future together. Jonathan and Patricia had married with the understanding that they would not disclose Jonathan's transgender status to anyone unless absolutely necessary, a decision that reflected both Jonathan's desire for privacy and their recognition that societal attitudes toward transgender people remained extremely hostile. When they decided to have children, they had utilized reproductive technologies that allowed Patricia to become pregnant through donor sperm, creating a family that appeared entirely conventional, and that raised no questions about Jonathan's ability to father children biologically. Their son Matthew had been born first, followed 3 years later by their daughter Emily, and both children had grown up with Jonathan as their father without any indication that his path to fatherhood had been different from that of other fathers. The decision about whether to tell their children about Jonathan's transgender status had been one of the most difficult and contentious issues in Jonathan and Patricia's marriage. Jonathan had felt strongly that his gender history was private medical information that did not need to be disclosed to his children, that he was simply their father, and that his transgender status was irrelevant to that relationship. Patricia had argued that keeping such significant information from their children was unfair and potentially harmful, that they deserved to know the truth about their family, and that secrets of such magnitude created barriers to authentic connection and trust. They had compromised by agreeing to tell the children when they were old enough to understand, though Jonathan had repeatedly postponed that conversation through their children's adolescence and into their young adulthood, finding reasons why the timing was never quite right. The situation had reached a crisis point several months before their Family Feud appearance when Matthew, while helping his parents prepare for a move, had accidentally discovered old photographs and documents that Jonathan had believed were securely stored away. The photographs showed Jonathan before his transition, and the documents included his original birth certificate with his assigned name Jennifer. Matthew had initially been confused and had thought perhaps the materials belonged to a relative he had never met. But careful examination had made clear that the person in the photographs was his father at a younger age, with different physical characteristics that Matthew struggled to reconcile with the father he knew. Matthew had confronted Jonathan and Patricia about his discovery, and after initial attempts to deflect or minimize, Jonathan had finally told his son the truth about his gender identity and transition. Matthew's reaction had been complex, combining shock at learning something so fundamental about his father that had been hidden his entire life, confusion about what the information meant for his understanding of his family and his own identity, and hurt that his parents had kept such a significant secret for so long. Emily had been told immediately after Matthew's discovery, and her response had been similar, a mixture of surprise, confusion about why this information had been concealed, and complicated feelings about the father she thought she knew versus the more complex reality she was now being asked to integrate. The family had spent several months in intensive therapy working through the implications of Jonathan's disclosure and the impact of decades of secrecy on family relationships and trust. Matthew and Emily had both struggled with feeling that their entire childhoods had been built on a foundation of partial truth, that they had been denied the opportunity to know their father fully, and that the secrecy suggested shame about something that Jonathan insisted was simply private medical history. Jonathan had struggled with guilt about the impact of his choices on his children, while also maintaining that his decision to live stealth had been about protecting himself and his family from discrimination, and that he had done what he believed was best given the societal context in which he had transitioned. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been made during this period of family healing, suggested by the therapist as a way to create positive shared experiences while working through difficult emotions and rebuilding trust. Jonathan had been extremely hesitant about appearing on national television, given the recent disclosure to his children and the potential risks of exposure. But Patricia and the children had argued that participating in a normal family activity might help them move forward together. Jonathan had agreed reluctantly, telling himself that the likelihood of his transgender status becoming relevant during a game show was minimal, and that he could simply participate as himself without his gender history being disclosed. As Steve Harvey began the game with characteristic warmth and energy, the Reynolds family played competently. Jonathan answered questions with intelligence and demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had served him well throughout his business career. Steve noticed the family dynamics carefully, particularly observing that while they appeared supportive of each other, there was an undercurrent of tension that he could not quite identify, but that registered as significant. The moment that shattered Jonathan's carefully maintained privacy occurred during the fourth round when the question appeared asking contestants to name something parents keep secret from their children. Matthew, standing beside his father, buzzed in first and answered with devastating directness, stating that they are transgender. The response was on the board as the number 7 answer, and under normal circumstances, the audience would have applauded and the game would have continued. Instead, there was confused silence as people tried to understand what Matthew had just said and why he had answered so specifically. Steve Harvey looked at Matthew with confusion, then glanced at Jonathan, whose face had gone completely pale. Steve asked Matthew to clarify what he meant, and Matthew, making a decision in that moment that would change everything, stated clearly that he had answered from personal experience because several months earlier, he had discovered that his father Jonathan was transgender and had transitioned from female to male over 30 years ago, information that had been kept secret from Matthew and his sister their entire lives. The studio fell into shocked silence as everyone processed what had just been revealed. Steve Harvey stood frozen, staring at Jonathan with an expression of complete disbelief, unable to process what he had just heard. Finally, Steve managed to say that he needed a moment to understand what was happening, and he asked Jonathan directly whether what Matthew had just said was true. If this story has affected you, if it has reminded you of the complexity of identity, privacy, and family secrets, Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss these powerful conversations about the difficult balance between living authentically and protecting privacy in a world that does not always accept difference with compassion and understanding.